Didn't even get out, just looked out and enjoyed the scenery. Before we begin our class, we just need to remember all the folks that are on the sick list. It's good to see some of you back, and we just need to keep the rest in our prayers. The Fullers, it's good to see Doug back, but remember the Fullers. Charles, Tina, Holly, Terry, Aaron. And also Tim's brother, and okay, if you didn't hear that, Kevin's dad, several cancer surgeries. This past one was a tear duct and part of an eyelid. Going to be reconstruction in about a month, and we still might lose the eye, so need to keep him in our prayers. Anyone else? Lisa, saw her this morning, but she was having difficulty Wednesday, I think. So, okay, Lisa. Jim, would you lead us in a prayer, please? Acts chapter 17. Acts 17. If you were here Wednesday night, Brother Quantz went through, and we're still on Paul's second missionary journey, and he had gotten us up to verse 15. We're going to pick up in 15. Well, actually, we're going to back up just a couple of verses. We're going to start in 13 just to give us some continuity of what was going on. But if you recall, Paul had been in Thessalonica, and the Jews there wasn't very happy with what was going on, so they left and went to Berea. And now picking up in verse 13, it says, "But the Jews of Thessalonica had knowledge that the word of God was preached of Paul at Berea, and they came thither also and stirred up the people." Isn't it amazing that the people in Thessalonica, because they didn't like the message that Paul was delivering to them, even when they left and went to another city, that group of people went, well, let me just ask the question, how far is Berea from Thessalonica? Approximately. Roughly 45 miles. 45 miles. Now, for us today, a 45-mile trip would be an hour or less, depending on road conditions and all like that. But remember, back in the first century, those folks took them a little bit longer to get places. For the most part, they walked. Now here, a group went 45 miles to stir up trouble in an area that wasn't even their business, so to speak. sort of reminiscent of what's going on in the United States today. How many people from outside of communities stir up trouble? We've got folks as far away as Wisconsin sending letters and causing disturbances in Georgia, school issues and things like that, prayer. So I guess we can say today there's nothing new, because here we see it was happening then. But anyway, they'd try to stir up the people. Verse 14 says, immediately the brethren sent away Paul to go, as it were, to the sea, but Silas and Timotheus abode there still. So apparently they figured Paul was the troublemaker. Even though the three of them were there on the journey together and doing the work, it was Paul that they had to shuttle away to keep him safe. And okay, good point. If you didn't hear that, Brother Cox said that Paul had been a Jew. Now they had looked at him as a traitor, so that would stir him up quite a bit. So that could have prompted their following him. But anyway, it was what he was teaching that they were really against. But they had shuttled him away. So we'll pick up in verse 15 now. And they that conducted Paul brought him unto Athens. Pause right there for a second. Athens, Thessalonica to Berea was about 45 miles. Berea to Athens is approximately 100 miles. You think they moved him a little bit farther than the 45 miles to try to keep him from tracking him on down? Probably not. But he went to Athens. And receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timotheus for to come to him with all speed, they departed. So apparently, Paul got to Athens, took just a very quick look at what was going on and decided that he was going to need help. And the people that had brought him there, he sent word back by them. That's the command, that he sent word back to them for them to come and join him. But that was going to mean that Paul was going to be there a week or more by himself, because remember, that's 100 miles. So by the time they go 100 miles and then get packed up and come back 100 miles, it was going to take a little bit of time for him to get there. So Paul is going to be in Athens for a short period of time by himself. Also, it's a good time for us to talk about Athens. Athens was sort of the cultural center of Greece at that time. All the knowledgeable, the philosophers, the lawyers, the educators, everybody, poets, they all would hang around Athens because that was the center. As we get on down into the lesson, we'll learn a little bit more about it, but they would come there to exchange ideas and information. Also, at Athens is a place called Mars Hill. Do we know how Mars Hill got its name? Remember, at this time, Greece is actually a part of the Roman Empire. Mars is a Roman god, the Roman god of war. But actually, as we read through here, we'll find out sometimes it's referenced the Areopolis. Well, Areopolis is the Greek god that's the Roman god Mars, sort of. When you get to mythology, you have similar characters, but they just have different names based on it being Roman or Greek mythology. But supposedly at Mars Hill is where Mars was once tried and acquitted for something. But again, we're getting deep into mythology. But that's how Mars Hill got its name, and that's how come we'll mention Areopolis a couple of times. And they were, Mars was only second in line to Jupiter in the Roman god lineup. And again, if you get into mythology, Mars was the father of Romulus and Remus, which again goes into the twins of Roman mythology there. So that sort of gives us an idea of what Paul is going to be facing in Athens. It's a city full of philosophers, educators, people exchanging ideas, and all these imaginary gods or the mythological gods that we're going to be dealing with. So it said in verse 16, while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. So again, as I just mentioned, he gets there and it doesn't take him long to look around and see what's going on. There's a different God everywhere. In verse 17, therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews. First off, this word disputed, if other translations have other words, I prefer the word reasoned with or discussed, because normally when we think of disputed with something or someone, what do we think of? An argument. But in this context here, I don't believe it was an argument. I believe Paul had his position and the others had theirs, but they were discussing the issues. And we'll see a little bit later, again, how some of this works. He not only disputed in the synagogue with the Jews, so apparently in all of the idolatry that was going on, there was some Jews, enough that they had a synagogue and a place to worship, and he met there. And where's the first place Paul always went when he got to a new city? To the synagogue, if there was one. So nothing new here. And not only with the Jews at the synagogue, but with devout persons. And he met in the marketplace daily with them that would meet with him. Does that not give us an indication of what we are supposed to do today? We are not just supposed to invite people to the assembly here and try to come in contact with them here and worship, but any place we are, if someone will listen, we need to be talking to them. But what do we have a tendency to do when we are away from the people that we know, love, and trust? We don't like to bring the subject up, do we? When I was driving a truck, the company I worked for, it was sort of an unwritten rule, but at the same time, it was promoted as though it was a rule, and for good reason. We could not bring up the subject of religion. We could not bring up the subject of politics. Why would that be? Pardon? Arguments. And if you are in business, the last thing you want to do is create any dissension between your people and the other people. But at the same time, the rule was if they brought it up, we're good to go. And I just love for people to bring up the subject and have a chance to talk to them. But verse 18 then says that certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him, and some said, what will this babbler say? Others some, he seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. If you had not read this verse before or had not thought about this verse before, it is packed with information. Packed. Who were the Epicureans? They were Brother Golden? Okay. If you didn't hear that, Brother Golden said that there was a philosopher by the name of Epicureans, and the basic philosophy was that it was all about man's pleasure. I'll add to that that his philosophy was that the gods were gods in name only, that they didn't have anything to do with what was going on in the world. That, quote, religious group, or that philosophical group, is about 350 years older than Christ. He lived in the, well, if we just say 300, give or take a few years, that is probably when his philosophy began. So that is that part. Now, the Stoics, who were the Stoics? They go back a little bit farther. Brother Golden, you had your hand up again? Zeno. Okay. I can't repeat all he said. I hope y'all heard him, but and this group goes back about 150 years earlier than the Epicureans. So, and neither one of these groups believed in the resurrection. Now, the Stoics were a little bit more friendly on the God side than the Epicureans. So that's those two groups. Now, when they said, what is this babbler say? Babbler is the name of a small bird that basically went around and gathered random seeds. That was their diet. So when they call him a babbler, they're using a metaphor, meaning that he is like collecting all these odd bits of information and then disseminating them again. So when they call him a babbler, they wasn't meaning, if we use the term babbler today, we look at it as a whole different thing, that he's kind of off bubble. He's not quite right in the head. He just babbles. But this is not what they're saying here, that they're just comparing him to that little seed collector. And they did that because he setteth forth strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. And remember, I said neither group believed in the resurrection. Now, also remember I said that at this time Athens was under Roman control, and when we had looked at it in the past week, what was the Roman philosophy about bringing in new gods, new religion? Couldn't do it without their approval, right? So it's going to get very interesting here when a little bit later on that point. But any questions or comments so far? Brother Golden. Right. He would have even been a little bit left of atheist today, right? Right. I'm going to read verse 19 and 20, and then we'll start with comments on them. But they took him and brought him into Areopolis, saying, may we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is. And again, Areopolis was also Mars Hill. For thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. we would know, therefore, what these things mean. Now, this group of people was different than the Jews in one respect. When Jesus was on trial, what was the attitude of the priest when they were trying Jesus? It wasn't so much fact, it was emotion. Remember, they tried to find people and get them to lie because they wanted to do away with Jesus. Well, here in Athens, they wanted facts. And on Mars Hill, Areopolis area, if something was going to be brought before them, there were 12 judges that would sit in council. And when the case was brought before them, and at the end, they didn't even speak their judgment. They had a couple of boards down there, and one board was for guilty and one was for innocent. And they would just take their flint or their rock, and at the end of it, they would just toss it on whichever board, whichever way they were going to determine innocence or guilt. But they were looking for fact, because here they said, these are strange things to our ears. We would know, therefore, what these things mean. So they were wanting to get together and bring them before the judges and glean information, glean fact, not bring emotion into it. Verse 21, for all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. All right, now they were there to hear new things, but what had they accused Paul of? Strange things. So apparently it's like a lot of people today that if they hear something that they don't want to hear, they will shut down. They won't even get in a discussion with you on it. So some of them were of that nature. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. Okay, he's standing before the judges, and superstition here, to me, would be better translated if it just said you're very religious, because that's the area that they're looking at. But catch verse 23. Again, to me, verse 23 is just as important as verse 18 that we looked at. It has just as much information. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. Now remember back in verse 18 and verse 19, what had Paul been accused of? Bringing strange new things in. Strange new gods that was against the Roman philosophy. Did not have Roman approval. But look how Paul framed his statement. You remember that statue of that unknown God? I'm not bringing anything in new to you. I'm just going to declare unto you, explain unto you what that God is. You already have him in place, so I'm not bringing anything new in here. I'm just going to tell you who he is that you already have a statue to. Was that kind of smart? So now they cannot accuse him of what? Strange gods, because they've already got an altar to one. Okay. Like I said, I find that verse particularly interesting. Anybody got questions or comments? Okay. Now, verse 24 through verse 31 is Paul's speech. And he starts out by saying, when he said, I will declare unto you, he starts out in verse 24 with God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. What do you think the Epicureans thought about that comment? Because remember, they didn't believe that God had anything to do with creating the world or creating anything in the world. On the other hand, what about the Stoics? They were more God-friendly. They still wanted to hear what was going on. So you see a division coming between those two. They had both challenged him, and now he's sort of shooting right up there amongst us, as we could say. Neither is worship with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things. Again, he is hammering the Epicureans because they didn't believe any of that. They just believed that, as Brother Golden had mentioned about the atoms, that all things just come into existence and control everything. Hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. Can you imagine how I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but in the first century, what did the Jews think about the Gentiles or Greeks? What did the Greeks think about the Jews? How big a division was there already among the nationalities? And now Paul is telling them, the God that made the heavens and the earth, he made all of us, and we're all of one blood. Would that get them thinking? Would that get them agitated? Some of them maybe. Pardon? Verse 27, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. Now, he's not only telling them that God made us all, but he's close by. All you got to do is look, reach, you can find him. And this next verse is misquoted a lot in prayers. How many of you have heard it? Live, breathe, and have our very being. Word very is not in there, is it? But anyway, for in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Now notice that Paul not only is hammering the fact that God is God and God created everything and God created all the people and we're all one, but then he goes down and says, as also your own poets have said. The poet here that he's probably referring to is Aratus, who lived about 300, about the same time as Epicurus. And he was also of the same nationality as Paul. So Paul would have been educated, would have been familiar with his works. And he was a poet that did talk about God and God's creations and things like that. So Paul is not only using Scripture and when he's talking to these folks and trying to get them to learn what's going on, he's even throwing back on, well, your own poets have even said this. So now he's getting them to start thinking. For as much as then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is likened to gold, silver, or stone, graven by art and man's device. And who thought that primarily? The Epicureans. So here he's just slamming them again. We don't think of God that way. Then verse 30, and the times of this ignorance God winked at, and I think literally just means looked over, passed by, just He didn't let it slide, but he let it go, because if you remember the discussion when it was saying, why did Moses allow divorce? What was said? The hardness of your heart caused it, but from the beginning it was not so, meaning it never should have been, but because of the way you do things, that's the way it is, or was. So he just sort of passed by that one. But now commandeth all men everywhere to repent, meaning, hey, what had been going on shouldn't have been going on. If you'd been involved in it, you need to get things right. And verse 31 says, because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he hath raised him from the dead. All right, let's back up and go through this one kind of slow. What does the word appointed mean? Appointed a day. Set or fixed a day. Well, judge. And who's going to be the judge? Okay. The judge was ordained, meaning Christ, meaning that's the one that was in place. And then he had given assurance. What would be another word for assurance? Certainty or proof or validity or anything you want to put down there. But that verse just told them that this is going to happen. Now, before we read the next verse, if you were an Epicurean or even a Stoic, what would come to mind when he said that would raise from the dead? Wouldn't that be the final nail after you'd already been berated? Not berated. From Paul's outlook, he was only telling the truth. But from their aspect, they had been pounced on through all these verses. And then the final one was, there's going to be a resurrection, which neither one of the groups believed. So, in my opinion anyway, in verse 32, when it says, and when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. Now, when they had these courts, it was very orderly, because remember I said they wanted to get the facts. But when they got to this point, I don't believe Paul had finished his speech. I believe they interrupted at this point when he brought up resurrection, because it said some mocked and others said, we will hear thee again of this matter. Now, which group do you think mocked? Epicureans. Which group wanted to hear more about it? Stoics. So see how all this falls together? Questions or comments? Verse 33. Before we read 33, let's go back to verse 23. In verse 23, it said, as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, the unknown God, whom therefore you ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you. And that's what he had been doing through his whole speech. And now, when he was mocked, he realized at this point that some wanted to hear and others didn't. But where was he? What was he to do? Sometimes when objections reach a certain point, it's best to back off and try again later. And so here, Paul departed from among them. So he walked away before it got any more argumentative or any more, Brother Jeremy? Yes, sir. And as you say, we need to take people from where they are and build on that knowledge, and or correct it in some cases, and go from there. Absolutely. So if we just use this as our guide, that would give us a real good roadmap of how we should do things. Then we get down to verse 34. It says, "Howbeit certain men clave unto him and believed." So remember where he is and remember who's listening. And certain men wanted to hear more. Others already started believing, among the which was Dionysius the Areopagite. That's a hard word to say sometimes. Areopagite. Now, why would we even mention a person by name? Because previously he said that certain men clave unto him and believed, but then he specifically mentions Dionysius the Areopagite. Why would he bring his name up? Who is he? Well, who was on this mountain, Areopagus? Who were the judges? Most apparently, he was either one of the judges or one of the people that was in the court, because it was the court of Areopagus. So, even today in a courtroom setting, we have judges, if you want to put them in there, the lawyers, the clerks, the recorders. So again, back in those days, they would have a similar setup. It wouldn't be just the judges; they would have the group there. But apparently, he wanted to mention this person by name to show that even an official at this hearing was convinced of what was going on and believed. Because then he goes down and says a woman named Damaris. What do we know about Damaris? Absolutely nothing. This is the only verse that name is mentioned. But again, I think it was mentioned for a specific purpose. Instead of just saying a lot believed, then he could go down and name a name. Yes, sir. Right. I agree with that. Brother Jeremy said that these were letters that were being sent around, so there might be some other person that knew this person or knew of. So I mean, it's sort of like the 7 letters to the 7 churches in Asia. There were 7 letters, and they all went around so they could share the information, and others with them. So apparently in his one speech there, he convinced several because they believed, named a couple of them, and then there were others. Others wanted to hear more about what was going on, and others mocked, which means they didn't want to hear it. Is that not the way we find things today? Do we not find things where you get together and some people are going to understand what you're saying, believe what you're saying. Some not quite convinced, but want to hear more, and others just want to turn a deaf ear and move away. And that's not only dealing with the Bible, but people shut down when you start talking sports. If they've got their opinion, they'll shut down. Politics, they'll shut down. And religion, those are the three things that you need to be careful about how you talk about, right? We have finished chapter 14. Luke's out putting numbers on the board. Is there any questions or comments then about anything that we have done in chapter 17? I said chapter 14, but chapter 17. Nothing? Brother Gold? Okay. Anybody else? We got about 3 minutes, so I'm going to at least start chapter 18. And after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. Now, we don't know how long he was in Athens. We know this part took place, and that some wanted to hear and other things like that, and that he had sent for his two companions to come. So like I say, he was probably in Athens at least a week, maybe a couple of weeks. But then he departs from Athens and came to Corinth. I really don't want to get into Corinth that deeply, because this is the missionary trip where Paul is going to establish the church at Corinth. And then about 5 years later is when he's going to write 1 Corinthians back to the Corinthians and follow up on some stuff. So, but he had found there a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. Claudius was the emperor, and if you recall, he was the predecessor to Nero. Nero became the emperor in 58 AD, so this had to happen before 58, while Claudius was the emperor. And what he had done, when it said that he had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, they're basically talking about the city of Rome, where they all had to leave. And this is why these people are where they are right now. Claudius was one of those emperors that was most of them were sort of paranoid, but he took it one step beyond paranoid. He didn't trust anybody or anything. So, and that's why he ran the Jews off. Verse 3 says, never mind, we'll stop right there and let Brother Clance just pick up with verse 1 Wednesday night. Thank y'all so much for your questions, comments, and attention.